Hey everyone, and welcome back to another Tuesday tip, where in this video I'm going to be talking about the do's and don'ts of greasing your BMX bike. So when it comes to working on a BMX bike and applying grease to the different parts of a BMX bike, there's a bit of a rule that's somewhat generally accepted with working on a BMX bike, and that is to apply grease everywhere that metal contacts metal. And you'll see as this video progresses that this isn't exactly a hard and fast rule, and there are definitely places that metal touches metal where you don't want to put grease, and there's places on the bike where you'll see that grease isn't the right tool for the job and you need something like thread locker or a different type of lubricant. And with the help of my friend Kevin Czuba, we went over a list of things that you do and don't want to grease on your BMX bike, as well as the situations where you'd want something like a different lubricant or thread locker. So with that being said, let's get into this list and let's start talking about the things that you do want to grease on your BMX bike. So first, when it comes to applying grease like this Park Tool Polylube 1000 to your BMX bike, there's two things that you want to remember. The first of those is that a dab will do, and the second is that generally, unlike the everywhere metal touches metal rule, generally you'll want to grease places where two different types of metal come in contact with each other, and a perfect example of this is the stem. Generally, the bolts of the stem are steel, whereas the stem itself is aluminum, so this is a perfect example, and you will want to grease all 6 bolts of your stem. You'll have the 4 that have to do with the clamping area on the stem, and then you'll have the 2, most likely in the rear, that have to do with tightening down to keep your headset compressed. And speaking of your headset, you'll also want to lubricate and grease the compression cap of your headset as well. This is a place where aluminum in your headset cap or compression cap comes in contact with the steel of the forks, and those aluminum threads can definitely be damaged, and grease is something that can prevent that. To start off the list of places where you definitely don't want to put grease when working on your BMX bike, let's talk about where the handlebars come into contact with the stem in the clamping area. This is one place where two different types of metal come into contact with each other, albeit there is a layer of paint or powder coat between them. This is where chromoly and aluminum come into contact, and you definitely don't want to grease this. And this goes against the grease everywhere that two different types of metal come into contact with each other, but it's kind of common sense in that we definitely want our bars to hold fast and hold steady where they are, and anything that goes against that or adds to it like grease would is just outright dangerous and not something that we want while we're riding our bikes. While we're up here, let's talk about 2 more examples of things that you probably don't want to grease in working on your BMX bike. The first of those are your bar ends. Your bar ends are another example of where two different types of metal come into contact with each other, the aluminum of your bar ends and the steel of your bars. This is something that you probably don't want moving, so you probably don't want to grease them. And then the other example while we're up here is the fork steer tube in your stem. This is definitely something that you don't want moving, and I'm pretty sure I've seen people who have greased this before, and it's kind of counterproductive, and it's an example, once again, of where two different types of metal come into contact with each other. And like I said, it's a general rule to grease these things. Well, this is an obvious case where that rule does not apply. Zooming out on the front end a little bit, we've got 2 more locations up here that could use a little bit of grease when working on your BMX bike. The first of those is between your headset bearings and your frame, both on the bottom and the top, as well as if you have a female front hub, you definitely want to grease the bolts where they go into the hub. Moving backward from the front end, we reach another location that could use a light coating of grease, and this is the seat post. This is another instance of aluminum coming in contact with chromoly, and it's definitely something that you don't want to seize up on you, and you don't want to experience what you'll have to do if it does seize up on you. Also, right behind it, we've got our seat post clamp bolt. This is another thing that sometimes is built into the frame and is another place that you definitely don't want seizing up, just because it's a major annoyance if it does. And if you really want to get crazy with this, you can also grease the bolt for your pivotal seat or tripod seat if you have one. Continuing along with the places that you do want to use grease when working on your BMX bike, we've got the crankset. You definitely do want to use grease on where your spindle comes into contact with the crank arm. So between these two places, you absolutely need to use grease when working on your BMX bike, and especially when installing new cranks. But one place on the crankset that you don't want to use grease is on the crank bolts. There are two of them. One holds your crank arms on, and one holds on your sprocket, chain wheel, or chain ring, whatever you want to call it, unless you have a spline drive setup. In this case, you want to use some sort of thread locker on both of these bolts, or all three of these bolts if you have two crank bolts and a sprocket bolt. In this case, we don't want to use grease on these, and we do want to use thread locker, just to reiterate, and you absolutely need to use grease in between the crank arm and the spindle, especially when installing. Flipping things over here, we can talk about a couple different locations on the bike, all from this one spot. The first of those is the brakes. So when it comes to the brakes, there's only one thing that you want to grease, and that is the brake posts or mounts where the brake arms slide onto them. Not whenever you're installing the brake posts or the brake mounts. When you're installing them, you want to use some sort of thread locker, because this is definitely something that we don't want to move whatsoever. And the same goes for the bolts that actually bolt on the brake arms. We need to use some sort of thread locker because we don't want these moving either. We only want the moving parts to have grease, and that is where the brake arms pivot on the brake mounts themselves. Also, another place that you definitely don't want to use conventional grease on your bike is on your chain. You definitely don't want to grease your chain. You want to use chain lube on your chain, and this is something that someone could mess up, and if we aren't told these things, how can we learn them? So don't grease your chain, lube your chain. Moving to the back here, we can talk about the last of the things that you do and don't want to grease in working on your BMX bike. I've got two examples here of things that you don't want to grease. The first of those is if you have a male rear axle, you don't want to grease your axle nuts. This is something we always want to stay tight, so we don't want to grease them. And second, if you have a cassette hub in the rear, like I do, you don't want to grease it unless the manufacturer says to do so. But if you have a free coaster in the rear, this is something that does require grease, and it's something that I would recommend only doing if you know how to do it, or having a bike shop or someone that does know how to do it for you. Also, if you have a female axle in the rear, you do want to grease the bolts for that female axle. So before we wrap this one up, I want to talk about a few unconventional things that do need to be greased but don't apply to everyone. And these are loose ball bearing hubs, non-sealed bottom brackets and cranksets, and traditional headsets. These are all things that require grease, but in coming up with this list, Kevin and I both agreed that these are things that unless you know exactly what you're doing, you should probably take them to a bike shop, because you can do more harm than good by trying to work on them without knowing what you're doing. And like I said before, these are things that don't apply to everyone, but definitely need to be mentioned. And with that being said, that's gonna wrap up the list of things that you do and don't want to grease or to use other lubricants or thread lockers on in working on your BMX bike. Hopefully you guys learned something and found this video useful. I want to give a shout out to Kevin Czuba again for helping me come up with this list. And if you guys liked this video, let us know in the comments down below, as well as hit the subscribe button down below if you're new, because I come out with these tips and tricks videos every Tuesday, as well as BMX news videos on Fridays and other types of riding videos and streams throughout the week. I want to thank you for watching, and I want to thank you for being part of the 20% crew that made it to the end of this video, and we'll see you tomorrow for another video. Thanks again for watching, guys, and like I said, we'll see you tomorrow. Goodbye.